Welcome to Season 5, Episode 11 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to be talking with Ross Cooper and Aaron Murphy, co-authors of Hacking Project-Based Learning, and we'll be talking about how to manage some of the trickiest aspects of PBL, including assessment. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, links to recommended resources, and to share your thoughts on the show. So I have two guests on the show today, and they are the co-authors of a new book called Hacking Project-Based Learning, 10 Easy Steps to PBL and Inquiry in the Classroom. So you're going to hear from Aaron Murphy, who is an assistant principal and certified literacy specialist in the East Penn School District in Pennsylvania. And you'll hear from Ross Cooper, who is the supervisor of instructional practice K-12 in the Salisbury Township School District in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So Aaron and Ross are both very passionate about inquiry-based learning, and they've supported countless teachers in implementing it through not only their own school-based work, but also through the PD and the workshops that they conduct. So I'm really excited to have them here to help us move past some of the jargon and the buzzwords and talk about the realities of doing PBL with kids. For many teachers, it's a very different way of facilitating learning, where kids are identifying a real-world problem and they're developing its solution. It's an incredibly powerful, effective, cross-curricular way for kids to learn. But it's not always simple to plan and manage and assess. So we're going to talk about some practical teaching strategies today. We're also going to look at how to address some of the pitfalls that students face. PBL is very rigorous, or it should be, and we all know that kids aren't always excited about rigor and working hard. They can't just pass a test at the end of the unit and be done. With PBL, kids show what they learn as they journey through the unit and interact with its lessons and collaborate with each other. And they have to assess themselves and each other. So it's pretty complex stuff. It's a tough juxtaposition when the fill-in-the-bubble standardized testing mentality is something that they're also expected to juggle at the same time. So let me hand this over to Aaron and Ross and have them address some of the most common questions and issues that teachers today are facing around PBL. So how can a teacher make time for project-based learning? A lot of teachers want to incorporate more PBL, but they have a prescribed curriculum or they have some sort of pacing guide that they need to follow. So I'm wondering how many hours a day or how many hours a week are teachers doing PBL? And I'm assuming that that's different for elementary than secondary.
I'm going to let Ross jump in a second, but I just wanted to address the piece about the secondary versus the elementary. And certainly those two things look different. And I think that we'll talk about that in multiple different times throughout this podcast. But I think that the good thing about secondary is that I see less scripted programs at the secondary level. Which I think is a positive, obviously. But what I do know is that secondary teachers tend to be very content-driven in that they feel very passionately about their particular content and don't always look for cross-curricular opportunities, which is obviously ideal for project-based learning. So that's definitely something that, at the secondary level, we want to look for those cross-curricular activities and opportunities to show students the connections between their subjects so that they're not living in these silos, being ushered between the silos each day.
All right. So Erin said a lot, and she pretty much answered the question, but I'm going to add two things real quick. One is, so focusing at the elementary level. Typically at the elementary level, students are learning to read rather than reading to learn.
Yeah.
So this whole idea that, okay, you want me to do this, but my kids can barely read. And I think that if we dumb things down because they're learning to read, then we're doing them a disservice by not exposing them to all this great, engaging, relevant content and learning experiences that are out there. Mm-hmm. So to really kill two birds with one stone, you could take that reading comprehension, whether it's fiction, but in particular nonfiction reading comprehension, look at the topics on which the project is focusing and weave that into the project itself. So they're actually learning to read through the context, through the greater context of a project-based learning experience, because you could tie in nonfiction reading comprehension to pretty much anything. So that's one. And number two is a lot of times teachers will look at a chapter such as, let's take math, for example, because I think with the work that I've done at the elementary level, a lot of teachers, for the most part, if you're going to follow the series for anything, it's usually math. You're going chapter by chapter. But rather than, so if you're teaching a chapter, let's say on fractions, like chapter number 15 is on fractions, rather than just going lesson by lesson, it's, looking at the chapter as a whole and asking yourself, what do you want students to understand? What are those big high impact takeaways you want them to walk away with at the conclusion of this chapter? And really teaching with those in mind rather than the lessons in mind. And then when we have to focus on the learning and those understandings rather than the lessons that are in the textbook, that shift is really powerful. So in a sense, you're really taking what's in that chapter and deconstructing it based on understandings and not by the lessons. And then once you have those understandings, then it's easier to then supplement with outside resources that are more engaging and relevant for the learners.
I wanted to jump back in because there was a really terrific idea that one of our 8th grade math teachers came up with to approach this issue that you outlined, Angela, in a secondary classroom. And she, the way she has worked this into her room is she has sort of kicked off a project where the students were using triangles and their knowledge of Pythagorean theorem to design structures and bridges. And so she kicked off this project, and the kids enter her room each day. She does a mini lesson related to their content based on where she's supposed to be on the pacing guide. But then the kids get started on their project, and they're working they're working at their own pace, working on their project in their groups or individually. And then she pulls the students in small groups or independently to check for understanding and then provide follow-up content or follow-up lessons. So she's sort of using the PBL experience as like a center-based model. So the students are working on their PBL unless she's doing a mini lesson or pulling them for individualized instruction on the content that she's teaching through her pacing guide. So I thought that was a really unique way to work PBL into a secondary classroom model.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that could work well for elementary too. Mm-hmm. A lot of K-3 teachers are interested in PBL, but so many of the resources are geared toward older kids, and they have a really hard time figuring out what it's supposed to look like if your kids are, just learning to read, as we're also saying, 5, 6, 7 years old. So how does PBL work in the primary grades? What should a teacher expect?
And I would say, and we've actually been contacted by several kindergarten teachers. In fact, there was a group of kindergarten teachers that were doing a book study using hacking project-based learning. And they contacted us to find out how do kids do research and how do they create models? And I would say through a few different avenues. And as Ross said, these kids are learning to read, but that doesn't mean that they can't also read to learn. So using your shared reading opportunities and your guided reading opportunities, that's when students can be doing their research. You can be teaching them research literacy skills at the same time that you're doing a read aloud, pulling a website or an article or something up onto the big screen in your room, or if it's something that you printed out and maybe a big text, and instead of using a big book that day, you're reading text off your computer screen and using organic informational text for your students to read. And the other piece too there is that a lot of times we rely on kids' literacy skills to show what they know also. And then if a student isn't able to write out or explain in writing or what they have learned in their experience, then we kind of look at it like, well, maybe they didn't master that skill. So I've seen some really great primary teachers harness the use of a video blog for students to show what they know. So at the end of each lesson or at the end of a week or a certain amount of lessons, the students get to sit down with the computer and do a little mini briefing on what they did that week or what they've done recently.
I love that.
Yeah. And they love it too. And that's something that you get to post and show to their parents.
Yes.
And parents eat that up because it's like their sneak peek inside their child's classroom. Mm-hmm. And then obviously kids, in kindergarten, first, second grade, they can certainly prototype and build models in small groups with little teacher instruction. And that could be one of your centers. You're going to your writing center, you're going to have your guided reading center, and Then it's your prototyping center. And depending on what you're working on, students can certainly be building and playing with rubber bands and casters and wheels and trying to design something during a workstation.
Was that the teacher her name was Aubrey, and I think, was she from North Carolina? She was doing, it was hashtag like PBL clouds, and she did a couple blog posts about it.
Yeah.
And it was really powerful, the things that she was doing with her kindergarten students. And we actually like tweeted it out, think kindergartners can't do PBL, take a look at this. And I think a lot of times this whole idea that primary students, or just students in general, can't do PBL, that's more so the mindset of the teachers than it really is of the students. And a lot of, and a lot of the, and if we let them go, if we get out of their way, in general, they're going to do pretty amazing things. And a lot of these skills and strategies that we're already teaching students, such as how to think critically and how to effectively collaborate and how to work well with each other, that's really being done in kindergarten. But now, rather than doing it so they can comply and so that they pay attention, doing more direct instruction, it's doing within, once again, that context of PBL, so it serves a greater purpose.
Yeah, I really like what you said, something you said there, Ross. This idea that I've been sort of thinking about recently as I watch my 3-year-old explore her world is that, kids really think that they can do anything until someone tells them that they can't. So, our kids, the kids that are in our classrooms, they think they can do PBL. They think they can do anything. So as long as we're willing to let them try, I think that good things are going to happen.
So let's get into some of these issues that sometimes, make teachers feel like my kids can't do PBL. One of the most common ones that I hear about that is sort of these interpersonal issues. So they feel like, they're trying to do it with their kids, and whether they've tried it or not, they're sort of anticipating kids getting into fights and arguing over trivial things and, sort of being mean to one another. And I've heard from a lot of teachers who felt like, they had to pull back on PBL or they were too nervous to start because of these collaborative aspects. So I'd like to talk about what does that look like, at the elementary level with young kids and then also, with older kids. Can you talk a little bit about what teachers should do for these kids who don't have maybe the interpersonal skills to be as successful with PBL?
So I think it's a whole, just like with any type of, activity, whether it's STEM, whether it's project-based learning, whether it's robotics, I think our attitude should be, how could we make it work for the students that are in front of us, rather than blaming the students and getting frustrated and giving them less of a learning experience. And I think it's a very slippery slope when we start to blame our students and say, oh, the kids that I have couldn't do this. I think it's a very slippery slope. And to be honest, I was that teacher who said that earlier on in my career. But once I let the students go, I was really amazed at some of the things that they were able to do when I put my trust in. But I think a lot of times, just like with adults, we put a lot of people from diverse backgrounds in the same room or in the same group, and we just magically expect them to collaborate. And I used to tell my students, I don't even get along with some of the teachers in this building. That's just
that's right. That's good for them to know.
Yeah. So that, Erin was down the hallway from me, and we didn't get along all the time either. So, but letting them know that it's not just them.
Yes.
That this whole idea that you're not getting along with the person, the person across from you, but that's not just you. These are skills that you could build, and the whole idea of growth mindset. And to be honest, I'm a mindset it out. I'm kind of sick of hearing about growth mindset, but it's this whole idea that it is a learned skill rather than something that you should be able to do because I said so.
Yes.
Right.
So, and maybe Erin could talk about how we go about that.
And I think that that last thing that Ross just said is the biggest thing. We think that because we tell kids to do group work, that suddenly they know how to collaborate. And collaboration, as Ross was alluding to, with our as adults, as we struggle to collaborate, is that collaboration is a really complex experience, and so is algebra, right? And we don't just put algebra in front of and do algebra. We teach them how to do algebra. We model it for them. We show them different strategies. We, have them take notes on algebra. And essentially what we need to do is we need to model and explicitly teach strategies for students to collaborate. And that goes right down to, even when I'm working with middle schoolers, guys, when I'm collaborating with someone, I lean up on the desk, I lean closer to them. Notice how my body language, my arms are down. I don't have my hands folded. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not snickering at them. And I model these things with them. We do fishbowl routines. So we have, a group of students sit in the middle and actually start their conversation. And then we, as the outside circle around their conversation, talk about what was effective and how they collaborated or spoke to each other, and what was ineffective. What might we change? And then when I am having a conversation with another adult, I might be modeling, or I might take the time to go back and say, do you see how when I had a question about what that person shared with me, I phrased my question like this, because I wanted them to know that I was open, So again, we want to do think alouds. We want to model for our students, how we can challenge each other. Because I think that's the other thing too. I think that kids think that when they collaborate, it means that we never disagree. And that's not necessarily the case either. I think that truly teaching kids how to collaborate has to do with teaching them how to disagree so that they can create a better product. But it really, I think I said the word modeling like 6 times already, and I apologize, but it really comes down to modeling and explicitly teaching those strategies.
Let's talk a little bit more about how to give ownership of this to the kids, because I know PBL can become sort of a management nightmare for teachers, where the teacher's trying to oversee all the projects and keep everyone on track. How do you keep students on a timeline and help them manage their time with PBL?
I'm going to kind of piggyback that question with something else that we get asked a lot, which is about assessment in project-based learning. And I think that Ross and I really approach both of those things. So keeping kids on track, on time, and on task. And then also it's a way that we sort of like shift ownership of assessment. We use something called a progress assessment tool. And on the progress assessment tool, it's a 3-column organizer, and in the first column we list our learning objectives. So this is sort of what we at the end, very transparent. This is what we want all students to be able to do, and the students have this organizer with them. The middle column then is what the students are going to do to prove or show that they have that understanding, that they've mastered that objective. And once you get really comfortable with the PBL experience, you would actually create those expectations with your students by examining exemplars. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. But the reason I'm taking the time to explain this now is students use then that third empty column in the progress assessment tool to track and reflect on how they're moving throughout the project. And then as a teacher, I found that using a tool like this really helped me stay in touch with where each group was and where each student was. As I would do sort of like my daily conferences or check-ins with each group, I would have them take their progress assessment tool out. I would check in on where students were on reaching each of their objectives. And it really helped me target my feedback that I was giving the students so that I kept moving everyone forward. So rather than going to each group that, you can picture the group in your class where you went to them every day and you were like, hey guys, you still haven't gotten a roof on that structure that you're designing. What are we doing about that roof? And then suddenly our conversation becomes more about the roof and less about the fact that we're using right triangles to design the roof, and that we need to make sure that we're integrating something that's going to keep the residents of our home dry, because that's a basic, need in life. And so we move away from the objective and we're having a conversation about a roof instead.
Yeah. So the whole time, basically when you think about rubrics, they're messy and nobody likes rubrics. So people definitely shudder at the whole idea of rubrics. And a question that we always get is, how do you grade project-based learning? And we think that if you're talking about how to grade something to get a grade in the grade book, then the conversation is in the wrong place. Because if we want to put the emphasis on the learning and not the grading, then it's all about feedback. So rethinking the rubric from the ground up, the progress assessment tool, it starts with those learning targets. And when students, have that clear picture of what they have to hit, then they're able to drive their own learning through that constant feedback and through knowing what those learning targets look like within the context of the project. And that's really what the progress assessment tool does. The other big piece of that too is this idea of feedback, of looking at feedback as a learned skill, and not just, in a lot of classrooms, feedback might just come from the teacher, but we ideally want feedback to be peer feedback as well, students working with each other, but also this whole idea of student agency and awareness of students to know themselves without having to consult outside people, where they are on the continuum of their, where they are and where they need to go in order to hit those learning targets, and being able to have that awareness to know that on their own rather than talking to the teacher or other students. And one of the ways that I taught feedback in my classroom was actually through student blogging. And this whole idea of, I was really big on blogging, and I still am big on blogging, whether it's having my fourth graders on WordPress or a kid blog or Seesaw. That was, I left the classroom before Seesaw became big, but my students generally used WordPress.com or kid blog. And this whole idea of explicitly teaching them how to leave quality comments on each other's work. This whole idea of analyzing comments, uncovering what's a good comment, what's a bad comment, creating a list of what constitutes an effective comment, and that goes in line with giving effective feedback. So they were then able to make that transfer between quality commenting on blogs to effective feedback to provide one another and to provide for themselves as they were going through projects. So I think it's the learning targets, but I think it's also that idea of being able to give feedback, starting with the teacher, going to peer feedback, and then ultimately having that with-itness to know where you are in the continuum of where you need to be. Is
the project assessment tool something that I can link to in the show notes for the episode?
Absolutely. We have a sample that we can give you the link to. Okay,
awesome. Yeah. So I'll put that in the show notes for this. So if you're listening, you want to check that out, just go to truthforteachers.com and you can pull up this episode and see that. I think, finding resources for this is one of the tricky parts, finding these kinds of rubrics, these assessment tools, and also, coming up with the problems or the questions that drive inquiry projects. Are there any good databases or collections online of already created PBLs or resources like this that teachers can pull from or that you would recommend to them?
Sure. So some of the go-to tools that we like to recommend. First of all, there's this really great book called Hacking Project-Based Learning, where we do give you some ideas in our book. But then we go to the Buck Institute for Education, has a ton of free resources. Getting Smart, which is a blog that focuses on problem-based, project-based, place-based education, and they have a lot of really great examples there. Edutopia has a PBL page. And then there are databases like Learn21 is one that, pops out in my head. But the one thing that I would say about grabbing a sort of pre-packaged or pre-planned project is that the beauty of project-based learning is that it really should be differentiated for your classroom. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when you download one of these packages, these project packages, it ends up looking like a whole bunch of worksheets that then you just give to your students. And obviously that's not what project-based learning is about, and nobody gets excited about a 32-page packet. That's just not true. So I think that's my warning when it comes to looking for something that's already completely created for you, is just make sure it's quality and make sure it's going to be engaging. And if there's more than 3 pieces of paper, it's probably too much.
That's a good guideline.
Yeah. And I think it's this whole idea too that, just like when you're teaching out of a dreaded Basil reader or, a direct instruction, a math series that promotes direct instruction, you want to really still be able to be thinking for yourself rather than just regurgitating what's out there. So you don't just take something, implement it, it doesn't work, and then you blame the resource, Mm-hmm. So it's really, and that doesn't, like I said, that doesn't just go with project-based learning, that goes with anything that we teach or anything that we do. So ultimately it's having the skills and the abilities to really know what project-based learning is all about before we start searching for all those cool ideas. And a lot of times people ask, where could we get ideas? Where could we get ideas? Where could we get ideas? And I think it's okay. Ideas are fun. Eventually you're going to need ideas, but there's more to it than that. There's having that background in regards to what PBL looks like in the classroom. As Aaron said, it's also, it's knowing your students and your community, and maybe even your administration and your fellow teachers, but also making sure that it matches the standards that you have to teach to as well. So it's not just something that you're doing on top of what's already taking place. And that's how, we kind of perpetuate the myth that, project-based learning is fluff. So you really want to make sure that it matches your curriculum and what you need to be teaching.
If someone's just starting out with PBL, what should their focus be? What should be their number one priority if they're trying to do a project with kids for the first time?
So if you look at the book, there's actually there's 10 different hacks that we go through. And in going through those hacks, we talked everything about from student publishing to giving effective feedback to the progress assessment tool to classroom redesign to effective collaboration. So there's 10 different hacks. And one of the things that we talk about in the introduction is that, or one of the things we talk about in general, not just in the book, is that all of these are best practices and all of these could be implemented with or without full-blown PBL. So even if I'm this very traditional teacher, and I'm used to, teaching out of the textbook, and I'm kind of, scared to get away from it. And I just, as Erin would say, just want to dip my toe in the pool. Mm-hmm. I could look at those 10 hacks and I could say, okay, this year I'm going to focus on maybe redesigning my classroom and giving better feedback to my students. And yes, it's not full-blown PBL, but it's definitely steps in the right direction for the benefit of my students. So if I know that, okay, I get the bigger picture, I'm going to choose these. And once I'm comfortable with them, I am then going to move on to something else. I think that's okay, because if you're a traditional teacher and you're starting to give effective feedback and you're redesigning your learning space like that, that's pretty huge. So I think naturally this framework allows for all these. There's no one answer. It definitely allows for multiple entry points, which naturally differentiates based on teacher's comfort level.
Yeah, I really like that. That's one of my favorite things about the book is that you don't have to have, all this formal training and project-based learning and be implementing it exactly, this perfect way. I think teachers want to do the best job for kids, and they hear that this is a great thing. Their district is sort of pushing them to do that, but they don't necessarily have the resources and support. And I love the idea of them being able to just sort of jump into this book, learn more about the principles behind it, as you're saying, because, it's not formulaic. It's something that you need to understand sort of the theory and how inquiry-based learning works, and then go slowly and just try pieces of it. I think that's great advice.
No, that's good to hear. I'm glad you picked that up.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's fantastic. What's one thing that you wish every teacher knew about project-based learning?
I think many people feel like there's like this pie in the sky answer to like what project-based learning is, or they feel like the people who make project-based learning happen have some kind of magic wand. And it's really about moving. Why do we want to have project-based learning? We want to have project-based learning because we want student-centered classrooms that are preparing our kids to be problem solvers, critical thinkers, and they're ready for, the world outside of our classroom. That's why we want project-based learning. Honestly, any step that we're taking in that direction is a positive one.
Yes.
So because you're not the person that wants to jump in the deep end at full speed, doesn't mean that you're not doing something good for kids. So if you've taken the time, like Ross said, to redesign your classrooms so that students are more comfortable and feel more open in your space, then that's an awesome thing, and let that be your win for the year. If you've taken the time to get kids blogging and give each other feedback, then that might not be full-blown project-based learning, but it's a huge step in the right direction. So good for you. Let that be your win for the year. So I think that that's the thing we want teachers to know. Find the thing that you can change for this year or for, starting next year, and let that be your step. Don't feel like you have to do everything all at one time.
Yes, you don't have to do it all, and you don't have to do it all perfectly.
Right.
Ross, what would you say? What's one thing that you would like to close out and sort of say that you wish every teacher understood about project-based learning?
That kind of like what I said before, that it's not black and white. There's definitely shades of gray, and you don't have to jump all the way in order to really get started with it. And I think, one way to promote that, and I kind of said this before, but I'll clarify it even more so now, is so if we're doing project-based learning professional development, for instance, we would present the entire framework. So people are learning with that bigger picture in mind. And then it's okay. All right, now pick one. Okay, I want to do feedback. I want to do blogging. I want to do student publishing. I want to do student reflection. And I think a lot of times we forget those short-term wins and how powerful they could be, because as people who live and breathe project-based learning, we just expect people to be able to like naturally jump, to where we are. And, this whole idea of being empathetic to where people are and realizing that, we shouldn't, where we are at year 6, we shouldn't be comparing it to like their year 1.
That's right.
Like it's a completely different place. So it's, having empathy for where people are, and, and celebrating those short-term wins and letting them know, hey, maybe this isn't full-blown PBL, but this is benefiting your students. This is steps in the right direction. And then naturally, I think as people start to implement those little steps, it will naturally start to just transition to more and more, whether it's PBL or not, just better inquiry-based instruction for their students, that there are shades of gray. And honestly, I think that's not just with PBL. I think that's with a lot of things within education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, a lot of times we have this idea, and I blogged about this not too long ago, that there's one right way to do it. And if you're not doing it that right way, then you're doing it wrong. We have some people who read our book that said, man, like this whole time, I didn't realize I was doing it the wrong way. It's like, no, you weren't doing it the wrong way. You were just doing it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. And we should celebrate that. And, and there are some rights and wrongs, within education, but there aren't as many as we would think.
Yes.
And so I think it's important to respect where people are coming from, celebrate their short-term wins as they continually move in the right direction.
So there you have it. Lots of great advice from Aaron and Ross. If you want to learn more, if you want to get those resources we mentioned, I've also linked to all the different websites that they mentioned. I've linked to their wonderful book, which I highly recommend that you check out. Just head over to truthforteachers.com and look for the episode with Aaron and Ross, which is season 5, episode 11. It's called How to Hack Project-Based Learning. Have a fantastic week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Truth for Teachers is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. For more great podcast recommendations, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. That's edupodcastnetwork.com.